Good afternoon, welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. Having conversations on this program with friends, including people like Andrew Pachotti Bear, about how our modern society, particularly certain factions, have no reverence for the concept of laws and that laws are a malleable concept. Now, this is deeply personal for me, and so I want to begin there because having come from Malaysia, a nation that was initially part of the British Commonwealth, and it still is part of the British Commonwealth, but it gained independence in 1957, I saw firsthand how in one generation, laws that are structured to be just under the principles of British common law and the Magna Carta were immediately subjugated under a totalitarian sense of a regime that's almost theocratic. Here's the thing, we don't think about this way, but laws are beautiful. Our modern age has trained itself to treat laws as antique and antiquated. And that's why our public mood today keeps trying to treat laws as a nuisance. They treat the question of a moral grammar behind law as aggression. And so the concept of limits is an insult on personal freedom. But here's the issue. When public authorities and corporate gatekeepers and cultural tastemakers drift towards this kind of a progressivist spirit, and I mean this by definition, progressivist, well, then disruption gets rewarded. And the result is anarchy. You can polish it however you want, but it is social anarchy, and that's a problem. This loss of sight and appreciation for what laws are has come alongside a very deep confusion over language. Our language today has, in the public sphere, lost the notion that it has objective value. And yet, language is the bloodstream of a culture and of their laws. Every statute, every right lives by the words that have been enshrined, and these ought to possess stable meanings. Pope Leo XIV recently warned a new Orwellian style of language is developing. And he then goes on to say that freedom of speech and expression is guaranteed precisely by the certainty of language and the fact that every term is anchored in the truth. Now, my friend Joseph Pierce highlighted this in an article in Crisis Magazine. When a culture begins to sever words from truth, it severs law from justice. Because in order for justice to happen, it needs to be intelligible. And that intelligibility means that the terms and the definitions need to keep holding steady. Moreover, that kind of an Orwellian drift, it doesn't begin with slogans. It starts with softened vocabulary, and then you start moving towards euphemisms and flattery, and before you know it, morality itself is thrown out the window because conscience has no anchor. At that point, law loses its beauty, and yes, you heard me right. Law is beautiful. Just law is beautiful. Because people can forget what laws exist to do. They start imagining that laws exist primarily to block human desire. In a republic, however, and frankly in the Christian faith, laws serve the common good because they order our freedom towards human flourishing. It does so by drawing the boundaries that are necessary to curtail our freedom from acting in immoral manners. So, protection of the weak, the restraint of predation, the cultivation of a shared space where groups like families, schools, churches, and businesses can live without constant fear of either the strongest attitude or appetite or faction in the room, and live with the freedom of flourishing within limited government. And that's why laws are really a nation's architecture. It's not a cage. The whole purpose of sound architecture is to create a space where human life can unfold with real dignity and the common good. That's why the most humane laws accomplish something like the work of a well-built bridge, for example, because they make communion possible across gulfs, because competing interests can sometimes create obstacles, and competing passions can sometimes create explosions. And that's why our modern mood can grow a little strange. Many activists demand freedom, but they're allergic to any sense of a durable moral structure. And that's why when laws appear that protect, for example, constitutional rights of worship, of speech, of assembly, those same people who yell out tolerance grow impatient. They hate the work of the constitutional order, and they start treating all of their rights as privileges to be granted only to those whom they approve in their tribes. And that's why the public sphere fills with a kind of moral paperwork, and citizens will keep receiving new rules from social media, no less. And you get canceled, you get social penalties. Which beliefs deserve to be retaliated against? Which beliefs will be tolerated today? That's liberalism. That's the liberalist, progressivist narrative, and it's destructive. So when I speak about this, as I mentioned before, I have a personal vested interest. I have an affection for law, frankly. I lived in Malaysia, in India, and in the Philippines. I've seen firsthand how malleable law can become when social power, when local influence, and bureaucratic discretion begins to function like the ink on a paper that can rewrite a narrative. In other words, when the law can be changed to suit particular whims of power. And so a person learns quickly in those countries that the letter of the law can sometimes feel like a suggestion rather than a safeguard for my flourishing. And that predictability can vanish without warning. And that the vulnerable will pay the price every time enforcement becomes coercion, and selective coercion at that. Daily life in those settings is a long negotiation. You never know when law enforcement will turn against you, because everything's uncertain. The law might say one thing, but law enforcement will do another, and society will do something else. My friends, we have, without a doubt, the greatest heritage in the Judeo-Christian structure and architecture of law that we have in the West and in the United States. And if we take that for granted, if we set up a social structure that starts treating real just law as malleable suggestions, don't be surprised when we start reaping the fruits of third world nations. That's why when I look at the American Constitution and our tradition with fresh eyes, I'm grateful. I'm so grateful. I'm grateful that my bride and my children get to drive down the road and not worry of being pulled over with unjust stops and searches and the need for bribery to get away. I am grateful for an ordered constitution that puts my liberty and my flourishing and the freedom of my bride and I to flourish as a family ahead all else. I am grateful for the separation of powers that means that if I encounter injustice in one faction, I can seek it in another to hold the other side accountable. I am grateful for due process, for a jury of my peers. I am grateful for enumerated rights that don't grant me these rights, but state them as they come from God. I am grateful that this nation understands that the rights I have is a civic gift coming from God, and therefore it's beyond price. My friends, at this juncture, I turn you to Plato's Republic. Socrates insisted cities will find relief from civic evils when rulers possess philosophical formation. In fact, to quote the Republic, until kings are philosophers or philosophers are kings, cities will never cease from ill. Now, what he's simply pressing here, what Plato is simply pressing here, is that a society gains little from elections if the culture lacks not only virtue, but intellectual formation. And so, a nation needs religion, it needs virtue, it needs discipline. It needs interior formation. It needs an entire nation of people that knows that governing the appetites that run awry is necessary for the flourishing of a nation. Plato's Republic is a mirror to the United States right now. And so I think about Edmund Burke, for example, when he writes, liberty too must be limited in order to be possessed. That doesn't mean that he wants people to be in chains. He means that individual liberty cannot look like libertarianism. It cannot look like the wantonness to do what we want, when we want, how we want. Because a free individual puts the needs of other individuals and the society and the good of his family and ultimately his faith over himself. And so the betrayal here comes from the interior fallen human nature. And that's my challenge to you. Because the beauty of law really finds its fullest horizon when you look at the scriptures and the teachings of the Catholic Church. The God of Scripture reveals himself as a merciful and just God who gives laws. He binds his people through covenant in law. Because law is beautiful, because law is a gift, because law is a participation in his right reason, and it serves the common good. And so Christians honor laws for that reason. The path forward is a return to Christ, return to his church, return to right reason, and frankly, anchor our language in truth and the honoring of law in virtue. Stay tuned, I'm Marcus Peter.